All right, so let's move on. Let's start talking about these millennial folks. Let's begin with understanding the context of millennials in the marketplace. It took us a little while, but we kind of created this incredibly interesting graphic, and it shows you that millennials, roughly 100 million of them, which is maybe like 20 million more than boomers, significantly more than Generation X, and then there's a sliver of other generations. By the way, you'll notice that there are 6 generations in the United States. 6, this has never happened before. We've never had 6 continuous generations in play at the same time in the market. There are people who are called GIs who are still around, and there are people who are coming right behind the millennials called the homelands, and they already account for about $200 billion. So we've never had, in the history of mankind, 6 generations alive at the same time. That's because people used to die before the age of 45. So there was no time. Now we're living longer. Now let me put even that into a bigger perspective. This doesn't mean like much, doesn't seem very valuable or insightful. But let's take, for example, the homeland generation. This is the newest generation behind the millennials. There's roughly 22 million of them, which is just about the size of the population of Australia. And they have about $150 billion in expendable income right now, and these are like 8-year-olds. 8-year-olds. And so they have as much spending power as the nation of Hungary. That'll put that in perspective for you. All right, let's move on. We've got these wonderful people called the millennials. The millennials basically represent a number of people equal to the population of Mexico. But they have the spending power of the Czech Republic. Interesting perspective. You guys who are millennials, you still have your best spending years ahead of you when you see some of the numbers coming behind shortly. So let's move on. Let's look at Generation X. Generation X has the population of France, roughly, 65 million, and the gross domestic product of South Korea. These are the markets. So each one of them represents a pretty darn good market. Now let's talk about my generation, the boomers. We, by the way, invented generational marketing. That's why we talk about it all the time. And we have kind of an opportunity for bragging rights because we represent a very interesting population. The population of Germany, but the gross domestic product of the United Kingdom, $2.2 trillion. 2.2 trillion. Okay, so that's all we need to care about because the other generations are old, right? They don't spend anything, they're not important, there aren't that many of them. Sorry, not quite right. Let's not forget that in addition to the millennials and all the others, there are still some 32 million silents. 32 million silents, which is the population of Morocco and the gross domestic product of Poland, $600 billion. Okay, then we're through because there's only really old people after that, right? Only the GIs, yes?
Define silence?
Silence, there's a book called Generations by Ward and Howe, and they basically have, it's called Generations, you'll have a hard time finding it, and an even more difficult time reading it. It's 1,000 pages of charts and data. But if you find it, they're the guys who kind of gave these names to generations. Silence are basically the generation between the GI generation and the boomer generation. So they're sort of that sandwich in between. And you can see why they're silent. I mean, the GIs made a big mark and the boomers made a big mark, and the silence. But pay attention to the silence, because as you'll see later, there's a value to paying attention to prior generations. Okay? So silence, roughly $600 billion. Okay, now we're done, because it's only really old people. And after all, there's only about 3 million remaining people in the GI generation are 85 and over. Only 3 million of them left. Well, that's roughly the population of Ireland. So if you write off the GIs, you write off Ireland. Anybody here object to that? A couple of you. And also the gross domestic product of Vietnam, $100 billion. So when we talk about millennials, we have to keep in mind that there's this whole other context for generations. Each one of them still represents a very viable market. And while we're going to talk about millennials, we urge you very strongly to keep reminding yourself that those guys are still spending money, all of the other generations. Let's go on. What we're going to do now is give you a quick view. This is kind of the question you asked very quickly. Is the silent generation is basically between the ages of 68 and 85. I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but there is this information, and I will say right now that if anybody wants an electronic version of this deck, come up to us afterwards, give us your business card, we'll hug you and kiss you and send you some wonderful information later. So we're not going to bother going through all of this, but here is an overview of the generations, the numbers, their birth years in 2010, and their ages, and it's wonderful. Okay, having said that, what we're now going to look at is what we call generational micro-values systems. Each generation has a separate and distinct micro-values system. We're going to talk about some of those right now. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to look at some fundamental Americanisms, things that are defining. Like, for example, education. Education is certainly a common understanding, right? Everybody has an education. By the way, only 27% of Americans have upper education, which is something to think about later. But education basically is different for each generation. For the GIs, it was a dream. You hoped you could get one. For the silents, it was a privilege, something you had to earn and you were responsible for. We boomers kind of thought of education as our fundamental birthright. We're entitled to one and a loan with which to pay for it. Thank you. Generation X looks at education as a means to an end. What job do I want? That'll define what education I look for. Millennials look at education as their job. Their job is education. If you manage millennials, you will find out shortly that if they're not learning, they're out of there. Because they're interchanging job and learning, learning and job. Generation Homeland, we're going to talk about in a general sense later, but they're 8 years old right now. So we don't know what's going to happen, but we do have some hints. More on that later. Let's look at work. Work for the generation's GIs was truly labor, hard work. For silents, it was the duty, the responsibility to do what you needed to do. For us boomers, work is a source of personal fulfillment. That's why you have such long resumes, many jobs. Generation X looks at basically as a job as something that you need to do so that you have money so that you can have a life. And our friends the millennials look at work as learning. Learning and work are interchangeable, constantly interchangeable. Think of that in a marketing sense, and if they're not learning, what's the point of shopping? So information and learning is a key component. And in store, they better find something out that's interesting. We'll see that momentarily. So learning is always the key, no matter what happens. What about the home? Because everything that you buy eventually ends up in a home, right? As George Carlin observed, the home is the reason for American consumerism. A home is a place. Once you have a home, you need to fill it with stuff. Voila, consumerism.